On a warm and sunny afternoon, the city street was alive with the usual hustle and bustle of urban life. Crowds of people moved briskly along the busy sidewalks, some with shopping bags from the high-end stores that lined the avenue. The sound of chatter, footsteps, and car horns filled the air as everyone seemed to be in a hurry to get somewhere. In stark contrast to the polished world of wealth and luxury, there was a man sitting on the sidewalk in the shadow of a narrow alleyway. His clothes were ragged, his face worn with age and hardship. A black beggar, largely ignored by passers-by, sat with his head slightly bowed, hands outstretched, asking for spare change with a quiet, humble voice. His life had been a series of struggles, each one taking its toll on him. He had long given up trying to change the world's perception of him, and instead he endured in silence, knowing that most people saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. The world had discarded him, just as it had done to many others like him. Today, like any other, he simply sat and waited for someone to show a shred of compassion, though he knew it was unlikely. A well-dressed, wealthy white woman walked past him, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement, her head held high. Her appearance screamed privilege. She wore a pristine designer outfit, her hair perfectly styled, and her expensive sunglasses shielded her eyes from the sun, adding to her air of superiority. As she neared the beggar, she glanced at him with a mixture of disgust and disdain, her lips curling into a sneer. Her son, a young boy of about 7, ran ahead of her, laughing joyfully as he clutched a toy in his hands, oblivious to the world around him. He was carefree, wrapped in the safety of his mother's wealth and the privileges that came with it. The woman's eyes briefly locked onto the beggar as she approached, and she made sure her voice was loud enough for others to hear. "Get a job, you worthless piece of trash. You're a disgrace to this city," she hissed, the venom in her words evident. Her tone was dripping with contempt as she continued walking, making no effort to conceal her disdain for the man sitting on the ground. Her words were meant to degrade, to remind him of his place in society, far beneath her, in her mind. As she walked away, the beggar didn't flinch. He remained still, his eyes lowered, and his face impassive. There was no anger or frustration in his gaze, just a quiet dignity that refused to be broken by her cruelty. He had heard such insults countless times before, but today, for some reason, something stirred within him, a calm strength that he had long since learned to cultivate. He didn't need to defend himself. His worth was not defined by the opinions of strangers. The woman continued her march down the sidewalk, ignoring the few curious glances from others who had overheard her words. Her son, still ahead, continued to run and play, blissfully unaware of what had just transpired. He was a child, full of life and energy, with no understanding of the harshness of the world. As he sprinted ahead, his laughter echoing through the street, he failed to notice the danger lurking just around the corner. The street had a sharp curve, and as he ran, he didn't see the speeding car that was about to turn, its driver distracted by something in the distance. The beggar's gaze, though focused on the ground, suddenly flicked upward as the sound of the car's engine revving grew louder. Without thinking, he surged to his feet, his body reacting with the urgency of someone who had spent years in survival mode. In one swift motion, he dashed toward the boy, reaching him just as the car came around the corner, too fast for anyone to stop. The boy, startled and unaware of the imminent danger, froze for a split second as the car's headlights bore down on him. The beggar, his every muscle straining, grabbed the boy and yanked him out of the car's path, pulling him back onto the sidewalk with seconds to spare. The car screeched to a halt, the driver's face pale with fear as he realized just how close the boy had come to danger. The beggar, still holding the boy in his arms, gently set him back down on his feet. The child, shaken but unharmed, blinked in confusion before looking up at the man who had just saved his life. The woman, who had been walking ahead, turned around just in time to see the beggar pull her son to safety. Her face went pale, her mouth opening in disbelief. For the first time, she saw the man in front of her not as a beggar or a nuisance, but as a hero. The weight of her earlier words hit her like a ton of bricks. The very person she had insulted without a second thought had just saved her son's life. The beggar, once a proud and successful man, carried the weight of his past in his weathered face and tired eyes. He had once been a well-respected member of his community. His life had been full of promise. He had a career, a loving wife, and a family that meant the world to him. But fate had dealt him a harsh hand. After losing his job to a company restructuring, the downward spiral was quick and unforgiving. His wife fell ill shortly after, and, despite all efforts, she passed away, leaving him alone and heartbroken. The loss of his partner, both emotionally and financially, became too much to bear. With nowhere else to turn, he found himself living on the streets. The man never thought he would end up in such a place. Begging for spare change on busy street corners and alleyways was never a part of his plan. Yet here he was, trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. Though he had no home, no steady income, and no family, he still clung to the values that had shaped him: dignity, hard work, and a desire to help others. Despite his circumstances, the beggar never allowed his situation to define him. He kept a sharp sense of responsibility. He didn't beg out of laziness, but out of necessity. Though he had little to offer, he still helped where he could. On the rare occasion when someone else was in need, he would share whatever change he could spare. His compassion for others remained intact, no matter how much life had stripped away from him. His pride and self-respect never faltered. He refused to let the world view him as less than he was, an individual who had simply fallen on hard times, not someone defined by his misfortune. In stark contrast, the woman walking past him had been raised in a world of privilege, a world that saw the beggar as nothing more than an object of disdain. She grew up in an environment that reinforced the idea that money, status, and outward appearances were the only things that truly mattered. Her parents had always instilled in her the belief that those with wealth and success were inherently superior. Class divisions were a fact of life, and anyone who fell outside that privileged circle was beneath her. She had been conditioned to view the world in a narrow, binary way: those with wealth and power, and those without, who were often dismissed as lazy or undeserving. The woman's sense of entitlement was palpable as she strolled through the busy street, her designer clothes and expensive accessories a visual testament to her upbringing. Her son, around 7 years old, trailed behind her, a playful look on his face as he held a new toy in his hands. She doted on her son, raising him with the same narrow worldview she had been taught. To her, it was clear that success came with money and status. Nothing else mattered. She didn't see beyond the surface. She didn't try to understand the people around her, particularly those who didn't fit into her idea of success. Her son, innocent and unaware, was being molded in this image of privilege and superiority. When the woman saw the beggar sitting on the sidewalk, her response was immediate and sharp. In her eyes, he represented everything she had been taught to disdain: someone who didn't have the drive to better himself, someone who was nothing more than an eyesore in her world of comfort and wealth. Her words were venomous, and she made sure the beggar heard them, fully aware of the impact her insults would have. "Get a job, you worthless piece of trash. You're a disgrace to this city," she said, her voice dripping with contempt as she walked past him, her son oblivious to the cruel words. The beggar, however, didn't respond. He held his head low, but in his eyes was a quiet pride. He knew his worth, and no insult, no matter how cutting, could take that from him. He had lived through too much to be shaken by such baseless cruelty. Instead, he continued to sit, watching the world pass him by, silently waiting for the opportunity to help others, should it ever come his way. Little did he know, the very woman who had just insulted him would soon come to realize the true value of a man she had written off without a second thought. Meanwhile, the woman, still carrying the weight of her prejudice, walked on with her son, unaware of the moment that was about to unfold. The confrontation was swift and cutting. As the woman passed by the beggar, she made no attempt to mask her disdain. "Lazy, good-for-nothing bum," she muttered, her voice dripping with scorn as she shot him a venomous sneer. She wasn't concerned with the fact that she was speaking loudly enough for others to hear. Her judgment was final, her superiority absolute. The beggar, already accustomed to harsh words from strangers, didn't flinch. His eyes were cast downward, and he looked away from the venom she spewed in his direction. It wasn't the first time he'd been insulted or dismissed by someone who didn't understand his struggles. He had learned long ago that the hatred of others wasn't his burden to carry. But the woman's cruel words didn't end there. She walked away with her son in tow, who was happily running ahead, oblivious to his mother's words or the scene she had just caused. The boy's laughter echoed faintly in the busy street, his toy clutched tightly in his small hands. He ran across the pavement, weaving in and out of pedestrians, too caught up in his play to notice the danger he was heading toward. As the woman continued her stroll, her focus on the shopping bags in her hands, she failed to see the impending danger her son was in. The traffic light at the crosswalk switched to green, and a car surged forward at full speed, not slowing as it approached the busy intersection. The boy, still caught in his game, ran too far into the street, unaware of the vehicle coming directly at him. He didn't hear the screeching tires, nor did he see the headlights growing brighter as the car neared. The woman, now several steps ahead and distracted, remained unaware of the peril her son was in. From the corner of his eye, the beggar saw the danger unfolding. His gaze, heavy with years of experience, had been observing the scene from his spot on the sidewalk. Despite his ragged appearance, he had an almost instinctual awareness of what was happening around him. He saw the boy running toward disaster. Without a second thought, the beggar's body sprang into action. With an astonishing burst of speed, he jumped to his feet and sprinted toward the boy. In one swift motion, he reached out and grabbed the child, pulling him back onto the sidewalk just as the car zoomed past them mere inches away. The beggar's heart raced as he held the boy tightly against him, ensuring his safety. It was a moment of pure instinct, driven by a lifetime of survival and compassion. The woman, now fully aware of what had just transpired, whipped around in disbelief. Her son, now safely in the beggar's arms, stared up at the man who had just saved his life. The woman's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. Her child had narrowly escaped death, and the one who had saved him was the very person she had just belittled moments earlier. But her shock and gratitude were quickly clouded by a surge of confusion and disbelief. She couldn't reconcile the image of the disheveled beggar with the heroic act that had just unfolded before her eyes. The onlookers around them, having witnessed the rescue, were equally taken aback. Some stood in stunned silence, while others murmured among themselves, uncertain about what they had just seen. A few couldn't help but voice their skepticism. How could someone like him be capable of such kindness? One person muttered, his words laced with subtle prejudice. "I'm surprised he actually did something good for once," another voice chimed in. The air was thick with doubt, the whispering and side glances revealing the deep-seated biases that many still carried, even in the face of undeniable heroism. Though the beggar's actions had saved the boy's life, the stain of prejudice still lingered in the crowd's reactions. His appearance, his past, and the assumptions people had about him were too ingrained to be wiped away by a single act of kindness. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, but he said nothing. He simply looked at the woman, who was still standing there, frozen, trying to make sense of it all. The beggar had done what any decent person would have done. But for those around him, his worth was still measured by a set of preconceived notions that went far beyond what had just happened. In the face of their doubt and judgment, he said nothing more. He simply handed the boy back to his mother, his quiet dignity in contrast to their whispered disbelief. The woman stared at the beggar, her initial anger now replaced by confusion, but she said nothing either. She couldn't find the words to match what had just occurred. The crowd slowly began to disperse, the whispers fading into the background, but the woman's perception was forever altered. In that moment, the beggar had shown her something she couldn't deny: his humanity and the power of one simple act of kindness. As the chaos of the moment settled, the woman slowly approached the beggar. Her mind raced, trying to process the extraordinary turn of events. Her son, once in imminent danger, was now safe in her arms, all because of the man she had just insulted. The anger that had once flared in her heart now dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of guilt. She looked down at her child, clinging to her with wide eyes, then up at the beggar, still standing before her. His ragged clothes, his weathered face, everything about him screamed of hardship. Yet it was he who had just performed an extraordinary act of heroism. Her mouth was dry as she tried to find the words to express what she was feeling, the gravity of her earlier behavior weighing heavily on her conscience. I never thought." Her voice trembled as she stared at him, her mind replaying her earlier insults, the harsh, dismissive words she had hurled at him without a second thought. She had accused him of being lazy and worthless, without even knowing his story. And now, this same man had saved her child's life. For a moment, she was lost for words. But the beggar, sensing her discomfort, simply gave a small, kind smile. He didn't seem interested in making her feel worse. "There's no need for that," he said softly, his voice calm and unwavering. "Your child's safety is all that matters. I did what anyone would do in my place." The woman opened her mouth to say more, but the words stuck in her throat. She had no idea what it felt like to be judged by appearance, to be dismissed and dehumanized simply because of where you were in life. She had been so quick to judge him, so certain of her own superiority. And now she could see that her assumptions were completely wrong. As the beggar turned to walk back to his spot on the sidewalk, the crowd, which had been murmuring in doubt moments earlier, now began to shift. The same people who had questioned his motives started to show their appreciation for what he had done. A few approached him with apologies, acknowledging his heroism, while others simply nodded in quiet respect. Their attitudes had changed, and the weight of their earlier judgment was now replaced by admiration. The woman watched, still processing her emotions, as the beggar settled back into his usual spot. His life, so different from hers, was still one of struggle. Yet, despite everything he had endured, he had chosen to act with kindness, with courage, and with humility. It was something she hadn't expected from someone she had dismissed so easily. The woman's realization came like a quiet storm. She had lived her life with preconceived notions, taught to value wealth and appearance over the essence of a person. But today, the beggar had shown her that true value lies in one's actions, not their circumstances. She had learned that no amount of privilege could ever replace the strength of character and the power of compassion. As she looked down at her son, her grip on him tightened. She was determined not to let him grow up with the same narrow worldview. She would teach him to value kindness, to understand that worth is not defined by wealth or status, but by the goodness within. The beggar had taught her that lesson, and she wasn't going to forget it. Have you ever found yourself judging someone based on their appearance, only to realize that they were more than what you assumed? Or perhaps you've experienced a moment where your own biases were challenged. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from as we reflect on the power of understanding and change. The woman's transformation was profound. As she reflected on the events that had unfolded, she couldn't help but question everything she had ever believed about race and class. Her son's life had been saved by a homeless black man, someone she had earlier dismissed and insulted, and that single act of courage had challenged the very foundation of her biases. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her heart, forcing her to confront the depth of her own prejudice. For the first time, she began to see the world through a different lens. The casual, unchecked racism she had perpetuated for years suddenly felt foreign to her. She realized how easily she had allowed society's labels and divisions to define her perception of people. It was a painful revelation, but one that ignited a spark of change within her. She couldn't ignore the truth she now understood. Her son's life had been saved by the very person she had earlier looked down upon. This was a wake-up call that she could no longer silence. The woman's newfound self-awareness didn't stop at mere reflection. She decided to take action, using her privilege as a catalyst for change. She began to engage in difficult conversations about racism, inequality, and stereotyping, conversations she had avoided in the past. She took responsibility for her words and actions, speaking openly about her transformation and encouraging others to do the same. She began volunteering with charities that supported underprivileged communities, and she worked to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. Her efforts to educate herself and others about social issues grew into a passionate commitment to dismantling the biases that had been ingrained in her for so many years. She knew that this was just the beginning, and there was much work to be done, but the change in her heart was undeniable. Months later, the woman decided to return to the beggar. She had spent countless hours thinking about the way she had treated him, and now, driven by a deep sense of guilt and gratitude, she was determined to make things right. She approached him with a genuine offer of help. "I want to help you get back on your feet," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I'll arrange for the medical treatment you need, and I can offer you work at my company. I believe everyone deserves a chance, and I want to give you that opportunity." The beggar, who had been watching her carefully, saw the sincerity in her eyes. He was humbled by her change of heart, but he also knew that this gesture, while kind, wasn't the solution to everything. He accepted her offer with gratitude, but he had one important reminder for her. Everyone deserves kindness, he said softly. You don't need to give me your wealth. Just remember that everyone has a story. His words stuck with her. The beggar's humility reminded her that true kindness came not from grand gestures or acts of charity, but from understanding the humanity in others, regardless of their circumstances. The woman knew that her journey was far from over, but she was determined to continue learning and unlearning. She was ready to do the work not just for herself, but for the world she now understood in a way she hadn't before. And as for the beggar, he had been given a second chance, one that was far more than just a job or medical treatment. He had been offered the opportunity to regain his dignity and be seen for who he truly was, a man with a story, a man deserving of respect and kindness. The woman's life had undergone a radical transformation. No longer blinded by her previous biases, she became a staunch advocate for inclusivity, fairness, and social justice. The guilt and regret that had once clouded her mind had now been replaced with a drive to make amends for the harm she had caused and to fight for a more equitable world. She used her platform, her wealth, and her newfound understanding to help marginalized communities, focusing on dismantling the systems of prejudice that she had once been part of. Her life's mission had shifted, and she was now dedicated to ensuring that others didn't have to suffer the way she had made the beggar suffer. As for the beggar, his life too had taken a turn. No longer was he the object of scorn and judgment. He was now seen for the man he truly was, a person of great dignity and compassion. His past struggles, though painful, no longer defined him. Instead, his actions and the kindness he had shown in saving the woman's son spoke louder than any label society had placed upon him. He was not defined by his homelessness or his hardships, but by his strength, resilience, and the change he had inspired in others. The support he received from the woman and the community had transformed his outlook on life, and now, instead of surviving on the streets, he was building a future for himself, with the dignity and respect he had long deserved. The final scene unfolded in a way that was both heartwarming and inspiring. The woman and the beggar, now working together, led community initiatives aimed at helping those who were marginalized and overlooked. They had become partners in change, united by the understanding that true progress begins with empathy, kindness, and a willingness to see others as human beings, not stereotypes. The woman's son, older now and a witness to the powerful change his mother had undergone, often visited the beggar, forming a bond with him that spoke volumes about the importance of compassion and humility. The woman and the beggar had both come full circle, having grown in ways they never expected. Their once separate worlds of privilege and poverty had collided, but out of that collision came a friendship, a shared mission, and a powerful example of how one act of kindness could change everything. And as they stood together looking out over the city they both called home, the woman knew that the journey they had started was just the beginning. There was still so much more work to be done, but with the beggar by her side and her son's example of a heart open to change, she felt hopeful for the future. Final line. Sometimes, the very people we overlook are the ones who teach us what truly matters.